Hello, class. In this class, we're going to be taking a look at the philosophy of consciousness as a background to the psychology of consciousness. Now, when we explore the ideas of consciousness, in the case of consciousness, the easy problems are to explain certain characteristics of consciousness that seem solvable by the classic methods of scientific observation and experimentation. For example, a conscious experience of pain may be attributed to an injury suffered by the body. And scientists can then investigate further and discover that pain reception in human beings occurs through one system of A, nerve fibers, another system of C, nerve fibers, and so on. The same classic methods can be used to investigate the mechanics of all of the unconscious processes, like vision and memory and attention and emotion, and so on. And that makes consciousness possible. And it's possible to then understand some mechanisms behind consciousness. Now, when it comes to the easy problems of consciousness, investigators can hope to identify the brain processes underlying them and attempt to understand why they have evolved. Or to paraphrase some philosophers, we can hope to find adequate functional explanations to these phenomena. Now, there are also some hard problems of consciousness that arise from discoveries made in the field of physics in the first half of the 20th century, and these discoveries made it hard to find a place in the world for consciousness. Everything was so much simpler before, when philosophers and scientists had no trouble in assuming that the reality of consciousness was at least as real as the reality of the physical world. But once the world in its entirety came to be understood as the relationship between forces and atoms and molecules, that left very little room for the subjective aspect of consciousness. And yet, as the philosopher Søren Kierkegaard would say, the subjective truth really is the only truth that matters when it comes to a person's life. And it is precisely this that constitutes the heart of what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness, or what some philosophers call the explanatory gap. And for these philosophers, no explanations about the causal rule of our states of mind and their insatiation in a given nervous system, the easy problems, will ever tell us anything about the subjective dimension of consciousness, or, to borrow the language of a philosopher by the name of Thomas Nagel, about what it is like to be oneself and to experience the quality of oneself subjectively. In other words, any solution to the hard problems of consciousness must do more than explain. For instance, the processes that let us distinguish the color red from the color green, which is an example of an easy problem. A solution to the hard problem must also explain how this particular subjective impression of the redness of some object can arise from the activity of our neural assemblies. In its simplest form, the hard problem may be couched as follows. Why does the activity of my brain make me feel something rather than nothing? And so the hard problem focuses chiefly on the phenomenological aspect of consciousness, whereas the easy problems are more concerned with the functional aspects. As often happens in new fields of study such as consciousness, a whole constellation of different solutions to the hard problems have been proposed, often contradicting one another. And so to help us understand some of these, we're going to look at some various positions and from various groups of philosophers who have taken on the hard problem of consciousness and how their various positions are classified conceptually. And this classification generally depends upon whether the philosopher in question accepts or rejects certain premises, which often for some complex combinations of positions. So various thinkers have taken a variety of fairly convergent approaches to categorizing the various forms of human consciousness. For example, the philosopher Ned Block, there are at least 4 main aspects of consciousness that are manifested in the waking state, and they are as follows. Access consciousness refers to any state of consciousness where, when you are in it, a representation of its content is immediately available to you. You can then use this representation as a basis for reasoning and apply it in your rational control of your actions and speech. The concept of access consciousness recalls that of the global workplace of a person. Then there is the premise of the phenomenal consciousness, and this corresponds to the qualitative aspects or qualia of our mental lives. In other words, what is it like to feel a pain, or to perceive a color, or to believe a belief? And then there is reflexive consciousness or monitoring consciousness. And this is the ability to deliberately scrutinize the flow of one's own thoughts, to engage in introspection, and to track one's own behaviors. And then there is self-consciousness, and this is the representation of self that imparts a certain unity to one's mental life. So, the expression altered states of consciousness really refers to usually temporary experiences in which people have the impression that the normal functioning of their consciousness has been disturbed. For example, after experiencing an altered state of consciousness, someone might say that they had an impression of living in a different relationship with the world, or with their identity, or with their body. And some altered states of consciousness may be associated with events connected to things like sleep, such as falling asleep, or sleepwaking, or being sleep deprived. And altered states may be induced by another person, for example, hypnosis, or by oneself through meditation or prayer or physical exercise, for example, or by a group dynamic, as in a collective trance state. Altered states may also be associated with pathological conditions such as a fever or oxygen deprivation, or by the use of drugs. And one example of a drug-induced altered state would be the very well-documented effects of marijuana on various components of consciousness, such as sensory inputs, clarity of perception, distortion of time, memory, expectations, functional associations, and attention. The pursuit, attainment, and consequences of altered states of consciousness may be socially acceptable and recognized, or socially disapproved and illegal, as, for example, in the case of certain drug use. In general, though, there seems to be an optimal register of external stimulation that is needed to maintain a normal waking state of consciousness, and levels of stimulation above or below this register seem to result in altered states of consciousness. For example, the extreme boredom that comes from being deprived of social contact for long periods of time can induce altered states, but altered states can also be induced by situations that demand, on the contrary, sustained alertness or a high degree of concentration. So being intensely absorbed in a task or a reading, or performing a sport, or being involved in a competition. Now, contrary to some philosophers, the thinker Gerald Edelman sees no intrinsic problem in the scientific study of consciousness. He summarizes his position in the following 2 sentences. If the phenomenal part of conscious experience that constitutes its entailed distinctions is irreducible, so is the fact that physics has not explained why there is something rather than nothing. Physics is not hindered by this ontological limit, nor should the scientific understanding of consciousness be hindered by the privacy of phenomenal experience. Now, among all the philosophical approaches proposed over the centuries to try to solve the hard problem of human consciousness, dualism and materialism are 2 that have gained the support of a considerable number of thinkers. But many of these thinkers have felt the need to nuance these 2 general theoretical positions so as to address the criticisms that have been leveled at them. For example, to avoid the pitfalls of substance dualism, some philosophers have proposed an approach called property dualism. Property dualism recognizes that everything consists of matter, but holds that matter can have 2 types of properties, physical and mental, and that the latter cannot be reduced to the former. Property dualism is also referred to as non-reductive physicalism. And according to this approach, pain, for example, would have a physical property, the action potentials transmitted by the various nerve fibers that sense pain, and at the same time a conscious mental property, the feeling of pain. And one of the arguments for property dualism is the knowledge argument. And this argument was first presented by the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz in the 17th century. And it was updated later on by an Australian philosopher by the name of Frank Jackson in the 1980s, in the form of a little fable about anticipation. Now, suppose, says Jackson, that a great neurobiologist has learned everything that she knows about color perception from reading books about it, but has never seen a single color in her entire life. The day that she sees a red rose for the first time, she will learn something new about color. What is it like to see the color red? Which proves, according to Jackson, that matter has 2 distinct categories of properties. Now, for modern property dualists, such as the philosopher David Chalmers, this option does not constitute a rejection of science, but rather a call to broaden its horizons by recognizing consciousness as a full-fledged entity, just as fundamental as space and time and the force of gravity. But the question of how subjective states can influence matter without violating the laws of physics remains unsolved. Not to mention that property dualism leads to panpsychism, the idea that all matter, even a thermostat, even a rock, has some conscious property, however limited that might be. Now, some dualists accept that the closed causality of the physical world must be respected at all times, and that no mental state can influence the brain. For these dualists, mental states do exist and are produced by the brain, but add nothing to its physical functioning. The philosophical position is called epiphenomenalism. It recognizes causal influences of the brain on the mind, but not the reverse. And some philosophers have defended a more radical position called psychophysical parallelism, and according to which there are no causal influences in either of these directions. Now, for an epiphenomenalist, the impression that our intentions, desires, and feelings directly affect our behaviors is therefore only an illusion, an epiphenomenon. Thus, we adults would be somewhat like a small child playing with a toy steering wheel attached to a booster seat while his parent drives the car. The child gets so wrapped up in his own play that he ends up believing that he's actually the one driving. Similarly, we give ourselves the illusion that it is our minds that are actually guiding our behaviors. Nowadays, among those who accept the idea of a physical world in which conscious subjectivity exists, many are also prepared to accept that mental processes might not exert any causal influence on the physical world after all, even though common sense encourages us to think that our intentions, desires, and feelings do directly affect our behaviors. Now, according to these thinkers, the subjective feeling of thirst that makes us head to the kitchen faucet has nothing to do with our taking this action. Even more surprisingly, if consciousness has no influence on our behavior, then it follows that our behavior would remain exactly the same even if we were zombies. That is, even if our brain activity were not accompanied by mental states. But it's hard to imagine ourselves as zombies, especially when we consider the verbal behaviors that we usually interpret as reflecting our mental states. And as some philosophers have tried to show, the difficulty of this position, by caricaturing oneself as a zombie with no mental states, who is busy discussing consciousness with other zombie philosophers, just seems ridiculous. Then there is the materialist or physicalist alternative of dualism that gets around the problem of consciousness by positing that conscious states may not be distinct from physical states after all. The effect of our mental states on our behavior is therefore no longer problematic because both are part of the physical world. Some materialists opt for a dual aspect theory that considers the brain and the mind to be the same thing, but seen from two different perspectives, one external and objective and the other internal and subjective. And other materialists, known as reductionist materialists, tend to simply reduce the mental to the physical. But they offer at least two different theories about the kind of identity relationship that exists between mental and physical events. Some reductionist materialists believe in type-to-type identity, in which a given type of mental event is considered identical to one and only one type of physical event. This is the theory of identity between two types of things, mental states on the one hand and states of the brain on the other. For people who believe in type-to-type identity, if a flame burns your finger and makes you feel pain, this type of mental state is identical to the activation of a brain circuit that signals excessive harmful heat. But many objections have been raised to the idea of type-to-type identity. For example, some people argue that before you can declare a given mental state identical to a given physical state of the brain, you would have to know precisely what types of mental states actually exist, so that you would not identify this particular state with a brain state that is actually identical to some other mental state. But there's nowhere near any unanimity as to what mental states really exist. Now, another approach is understanding the relationship between the body and the mind, known as functionalism. Now, for functionalists, what is identical in the two different physical occurrences of the same mental state is the function. the complete set of cause and effect relationships between the internal and external worlds. So that's a little bit about the philosophy of the various understandings of consciousness. Now let's take a look at consciousness from a philosophy and cognitive science perspective. Around the 1950s and 60s, behaviorism, the paradigm that has dominated the experimental study of the human mind since the start of the 20th century, gradually gave way to the cognitive sciences in the 1970s and 80s, which developed two major theories of consciousness: cognitivism and connectionism. Cognitivism equates thinking with the manipulation of symbols and regards it as an algebra that operates on representation of the world, just as a digital computer does. Connectionism, in contrast, equates thinking with the operation of a network of neurons, and argues that every cognitive operation is the result of countless interconnected units interacting among themselves with no central control. Connectionism does, however, retain the idea of representation, which it defines as the correspondence between an emergent global state and some properties of the world. Now, some critics believe that this idea of representation smacks strongly of dualism and maintains a separation between the mind and body, as well as between the self and the external world. And this conception of the human mind has also been criticized as too passive, reducing it to an input-output device for processing information. And some authors subscribe to a theory of thought known as Embodied Cognition. And they are influenced by pragmatists such as John Dewey and phenomenologists such as Maurice Merleau-Ponty, both of whom could conceive of actions and intentions without representation. The embodied cognition critique of connectionism and cognitivism, and hence also of functionalism, revolves around the idea that the embodied experience of the individual in his or her environment plays a fundamental role in human thought. In addition to shedding new light on some of the astonishing cognitive abilities that we display every day, so making unconscious inferences, coordinating speech, gestures, understanding language, the embodied cognition movement argues that many of the abilities that let us think about the world and interact with other people actually originated in the bodily experience of the individuals of our species. So the mind essentially cannot exist without the body, and the sensations of the body are what make thought and thinking possible. And this way of defining cognition by intimately linking the body with thought has produced some interesting alternatives to the epistemological difficulties of the representational models that we discussed earlier, and in particular to the restrictions imposed by linear causality, the subject-object dichotomy, the mind-body dualism. Now, among other things, it allows for a rehabilitation of the role of the emotions in cognition, a reconsideration of our everyday unconscious thought mechanisms as probably being of capital importance in our cognitive apparatus, and a recognition of the evolutionary data shown that the human brain has evolved in large part to allow the organization of social life. Embodied cognition is also consistent with the work of thinkers like Lev Vygotsky, who have emphasized the social and cultural environment as the main driver of the human cognitive development. Now, in the 1980s, a movement therefore developed that rejected the cognitivism and connectionist orthodoxy based on the idea of representation. And to understand the essence of this movement's argument, consider the example of a baby who is learning to walk. No one teaches her any rules for doing so, as the cognitivist approach would postulate. Yet by trial and error, she learns how to maintain her balance and how to articulate her limbs, while avoiding obstacles that would upset that balance. The connectionist approach is probably more appropriate for describing what is happening in this case, but another approach would be to seek a more complete understanding of this phenomenon by considering this baby's particular legs and the environment in which she needs to move about within it. Hello class, so now what I'd like to do is take a little bit of time and look at the psychology of consciousness. So, start off by thinking of it this way. Are you conscious? Well, if you're listening to this, the answer should be yes, I am conscious. And you probably already have a good idea about the meaning of the word conscious, and indeed of the word unconscious. In everyday conversation, we tend to use conscious interchangeably with the word aware. For example, how aware are you at this moment? Now, your answer will undoubtedly be subjective, and it depends on what you are experiencing. But it's also often difficult to describe to others what you are aware of, and for others to completely comprehend your sense of awareness. So that begs the question, what is consciousness, particularly from the psychological perspective? Now, consciousness can be defined as the awareness of our own thoughts, of our feelings and perceptions, those internal events, and our surroundings, those external stimuli at any given moment. And it creates our sense of reality, what we believe to be real and happening at this very moment. And it is central to our sense of self. Our sense of self is developed through being aware of what we are doing, why we are doing it, and the awareness that others are probably observing, evaluating, and reacting to what we are doing. So just take a moment and look around you. Look around your room. Can you describe your surroundings? Are you aware of your surroundings? Are you aware of what's going on in your environment? And then ask yourself the question, how do you feel about that? That's another way of being conscious. Reflection. Now, others cannot directly know what you're thinking, or feeling, or perceiving. And most of us have some difficulty conveying what we are thinking, feeling, and perceiving to others. And our own conscious experience is personal, it's private, it's subjective. And it's difficult to measure accurately or to compare with others. Now, if psychology is all about behaviorism and the observable, then how can we study consciousness? Well, in some ways, psychology is all about understanding consciousness from a psychological construct. And psychological constructs are used to understand or explain things that we believe exist but cannot see, touch, or measure in any way, physically. Consciousness is a psychological construct because it is believed to exist, but we are unable to physically measure it. And so descriptions, operational definitions, are constructed to explain it. And you can normally think of consciousness as a continuum. So right now you are paying attention to the words that I'm saying. But what were you focusing on 5 minutes ago? Maybe you were daydreaming. Maybe you were working on your computer or thinking about an assignment that was due today, making plans for the weekend, or maybe you were simply waking up from sleep. And all these different activities are mental activities that represent different states of consciousness. And our level of awareness of internal events and external surroundings varies throughout the day. And you'll have times when you're alert, such as during this class, of course, and others when you are feeling quite drowsy. And consciousness can be thought of as operating on a continuum from a high level of consciousness or awareness through to a point of being unconscious, being totally unaware. And the more aware we are of our thoughts, feelings, and perceptions and surroundings, the higher the level of consciousness. Our level of awareness of internal events and external surroundings are often known as our state of consciousness. And states of consciousness can also be divided into two broad categories: normal waking consciousness and altered states of consciousness. And we'll focus on these in a little bit of detail a little bit later on, but for right now, normal waking consciousness tends to occupy that middle part of the continuum between the awake and alert zone. Now, an altered state of consciousness exists both on the lower part of the continuum, that is, during reduced awareness, and the upper part of the continuum during heightened awareness. Now, there was a psychologist by the name of William James who really was interested in the stream of consciousness. William James lived from 1842 through to 1910 and studied the stream of consciousness experience. In fact, he coined the phrase stream of consciousness as he viewed consciousness as an ever-changing series of thoughts that can shift smoothly and effortlessly from one moment to the next, just like water flowing in a stream. And according to James, our conscious experience is, first off, continuous. It is never empty. Thoughts are not isolated and can flow easily from one topic to another without interruption. It's also ever-changing. It rarely travels along one line of thought and constantly changes as we become aware of new information. It's also highly personal in that it relies on our own thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. But it's also selective. We can usually choose to focus on some things and to ignore other things. We can focus on internal events like thoughts, feelings, and perceptions, or we can focus on external surroundings. And it's also active in that consciousness has a purpose to allow us to function in our world. And as William James says it this way: consciousness does not appear to itself chopped up into bits. A river or a stream are the metaphors by which it is most naturally described. As the brain changes are continuous, so do all the consciousness melt into each other, like dissolving view. Properly, they're but one protracted consciousness, one unbroken stream. Now, states of consciousness are viewed as constantly changing on that continuum of awareness. Those two broad categories exist on this continuum: normal waking consciousness and altered states of consciousness. So when we think of the normal waking consciousness, just think about how aware you are of your thoughts and feelings and what is happening around you at this moment. You have a real understanding of where you are, what time it is, what you are thinking, how you are feeling, and who you are at this moment. That is, you are experiencing normal waking consciousness, a state that is relatively organized, meaningful, and clear. Normal waking consciousness can be loosely defined as the state of consciousness you experience when you are awake and aware of your thoughts, feelings, and perceptions from the internal events and the surrounding environment. Your experience during normal waking consciousness creates your reality and provides a baseline from which to judge other states of consciousness. Throughout the day and even Throughout your time studying this module, your level of awareness is going to vary. You may focus intently on my voice, but later feel a bit drowsy and find yourself distracted by noise in the corridor or outside your apartment. And these changes are just part of normal waking consciousness. And then there's altered states of consciousness. An altered state of consciousness can be defined as any state of consciousness that deviates from normal waking consciousness in terms of marked differences in our level of awareness, perceptions, memories, thinking, emotions, behaviors, and sense of time, of place, and self-control. As such, this could include states produced by the learned technique of meditation, of hypnosis, but also by psychological drugs, including alcohol, from a fever, from a psychosis, which is a fairly serious condition where you lose a sense of reality, or even by daydreaming or by sleep. Altered states are often culturally significant and can happen throughout religious experiences. An altered state of consciousness can be induced deliberately, or it can occur naturally. Psychological states can also change over time. Think of a time when you were sick with a high fever. What did you experience? Did you lose track of where you were and what was happening around you, your sense of time and the ability to think clearly? Now, think of a time when you were at a party with a lot of friends. There was loud music and flashing lights. Did you find yourself absorbed in the scene? Did time fly? Have you ever been in a sport activity where time flew by? A time when you were extremely happy or less inhibited than usual, and time seemed to fly by? If you answered yes, then you have experienced an altered state of consciousness. You don't need drugs to deliberately alter your state of consciousness. An environment such as this can do it for you. But there are some clear characteristics that help determine whether you are experiencing normal waking consciousness or an altered state of consciousness. And these highlight the changes in psychological state. And the difference between these characteristics in terms of normal waking consciousness and altered states of consciousness are also something that is of real interest to us. So what are the levels of awareness when we think of normal waking consciousness? Well, awareness really relates to how conscious or aware we are of internal, that is within our body or in our thoughts, or the external world with the environment. And there are a number of levels of awareness that exist during normal waking consciousness, from having little awareness of internal or external events to being tuned in to specific ones. And it isn't unusual to swap consciousness with the term awareness, since they are very often linked, and your level of awareness influences the other characteristics of consciousness. Now, in an altered state of consciousness, your level of awareness either decreases or increases compared to normal waking consciousness. You become more or less aware of your perceptions and of your surroundings. When suffering from a fever, for example, you become less aware of what is happening around you. If you're experiencing heightened awareness, become more aware of certain events that are happening around you. And this has a lot to do with attention. At any given moment, an enormous amount of information is available from all our senses, memories, and other cognitive processes. And it is impossible to attend to all of this information. Your attention can be focused on events that are taking place in the environment, the external, or the inside of your mind, the internal. And attention can shift, consciously or unconsciously. Attention relates to the information that you are actively processing, either consciously or even outside your conscious awareness. Attention overlaps with consciousness. as what you are consciously aware of is often also the focus of attention. For example, try recalling what you ate for dinner last night. The answer requires attention in order to reach your conscious awareness. And a range of stimuli can attract your attention, including a novel stimuli such as something unusual or new, or changes in stimulation such as the volume of the TV suddenly increasing. Something that is personally meaningful to you, such as your name being mentioned in a crowd, or important for us to attend to at the time. And attention can be broadly classified into various types of attention. There can be selective attention, referring to the limitations placed on how much we can focus at any given moment on one stimulus or event to the exclusion of others. And then selective inattention, and that refers to the way we attend to or do not attend to information that may be relevant but emotionally upsetting. And then we can have divided attention, and that refers to the capacity to attend to and perform two or more activities at the same time. There can also be controlled and automatic processes within consciousness. Now, when you write a sentence, you may pay attention to its meaning or the spelling of a word rather than the process of forming each letter. The act of writing each letter or word is automatic, with little mental effort or conscious awareness. Automatic processes require very little awareness or mental effort to be performed well, and they generally don't interfere with other automatic or controlled processes. In other words, automatic processes require little attention and little thought, and can allow you to do multiple things at a time. Another example of an automatic process is texting on your phone. Many people are very fast and efficient at doing this. They are well practiced and know exactly where the buttons are, and so can create a message with ease. For them, texting is a simple task that requires little mental effort. Now, compare this to someone who is learning how to write a text. This could be someone who has never seen a mobile phone before, or someone who rarely sends text messages. And the person must really concentrate on how to create the message. It requires their full attention. For this person, texting is a complex task, as it has yet to be learned or mastered and requires greater mental effort. It is also an example of a controlled process. Controlled processes require full awareness and mental effort to focus on the required task. This person needs to be consciously aware of what they are doing and concentrate on how to perform the task. They are unable to complete another controlled process at the same time, as both would require their full attention and therefore would interfere with each other. And each person sending a text message for the first time is unlikely to be able to listen to an important announcement simultaneously. And that controlled process is also why it is illegal to text and drive. Both require full attention. Attention relates to our ability to undertake controlled and automatic processes. Controlled processes require selective attention, where a person must actively focus attention in order to successfully complete the task, and automatic processes enable us to have divided attention. And if a task requires little mental effort and attention, we can often engage in other tasks at the same time. Now, how do you know that you're in an altered state of consciousness? Well, for one thing, in an altered state of consciousness, you usually find it difficult to carry out controlled processes. Your ability to perform some automatic processes can also be impaired. In some altered states of consciousness, however, you may be so focused with a high-level awareness that you find some tasks easier. Now, there are also some content limitations to consciousness. Now, during normal waking consciousness, we mainly control what we focus our attention on, and our thoughts tend to be organized and logical. For instance, to read the pages of a book, you must focus your attention on it to be able to see the print. You need to think logically and limit your attention to what is written in order to fully understand it. The content, that type of information, of normal waking consciousness is therefore generally more limited or restricted than the content of altered states of consciousness. Our thoughts tend not to be as creative or as bizarre or unrealistic or impossible as our thoughts during an altered state of consciousness. And during an altered state of consciousness, your ability to pay attention to certain tasks can be increased or decreased compared to normal waking consciousness. In normal waking consciousness, you can usually prevent yourself from focusing your attention on issues, thoughts, or events that are unpleasant. During an altered state of consciousness, whether it is normally occurring, such as sleep, or artificially induced, such as by drugs, your mental defenses are lower, and the content of your thoughts and dreams may be both broader and deeper than in normal waking consciousness. The content of your consciousness, when it is in an altered state of consciousness, is often disorganized and senseless or bizarre or unusual. Or, to the other extent, its content could be extremely narrow or limited as you concentrate intensely on just one thing. And tasks that require selective attention may be impaired during an altered state of consciousness. It can also be very difficult to divide attention, even between automatic processes. And then there is perceptual and cognitive distortions. Perception is the process of organizing sensory input and giving it meaning. During normal waking consciousness, our perceptions are usually clear and rational. We can make sense of sensory input, and we can have a real awareness of our internal state or any external state. Your perception of sensory input is often quite different in an altered state of consciousness. For instance, you may perceive colors as being more vivid or duller. You may not perceive pain, or you might have a stronger reaction to it. Vision, hearing, touch, taste, smell, and balance can all be affected in an altered state of consciousness. And cognition is a broad term that relates to mental activities such as thinking, problem solving, language, analysis, and reasoning. During normal waking consciousness, we have a sense of reality. Our thoughts are usually rational. They're clear and meaningful. During normal waking consciousness, the brain actively stores information in the memory and retrieves it for use in thinking. Memory is a vital component of normal waking consciousness, as it is involved in nearly every activity we undertake. We can generally access our memories and remember events and experience processes in long-term memory in this state. And there is a tendency for cognitive functions to become distorted during an altered state of consciousness. Thoughts may become disorganized, as evidenced during some dreams. Thinking may lack logic, and problem solving may be impaired. The memory of events that occurred during an altered state of consciousness might not be accurate, and we may not be able to recall them at all during normal waking consciousness. Moreover, we may have difficulty remembering things that we normally remember in normal waking consciousness, such as a good friend's name or a telephone number. And then there's also emotional awareness. During normal waking consciousness, we are generally aware of our feelings and usually show a range of emotions that are normal for us and appropriate for the situation. We can usually monitor our emotions and even hide our true feelings from others. The way emotions are experienced is often different during altered states of consciousness. Emotions can be heightened, and this means they can become more intense, such as being much happier or much sadder. Emotions can be dulled to the extent that people feel emotionally numb. And this can happen, for example, when someone is in a state of shock following a crisis or personal tragedy. And emotions might also be inappropriate, as there can be a lack of understanding of the emotional reality of the situation. Consciousness also helps us with self-control. Consciousness allows us to direct our thinking and monitor our impulses and behaviors. During normal waking consciousness, our ability to maintain self-control is usually maintained. We tend to be quite reserved and avoid doing things that we think are risky or embarrassing. Our ability to maintain self-control is often reduced during an altered state of consciousness. Our inhibitions are lowered, and we might do things that we would not do normally in a normal state of consciousness. We might be more open to suggestion, meaning that we are more likely to follow instructions with little resistance or thought of the consequences. However, this is not always the case. Some people gain greater self-control in altered states of consciousness. And then there's time orientation. And during normal waking consciousness, we usually have a good awareness of the passage of time. It is perceived to move in real time. For example, when it feels as if 10 minutes have passed, about 10 minutes have actually passed. We understand where we are in time, whether it's night or day, what year it is, what hour it is, what day it is, and are able to focus on the past, present, and future. And time tends to be experienced at a different speed, though, when in an altered state of consciousness. For example, when woken from sleep after just an hour, you may be surprised that you haven't yet had an entire night's sleep. On other occasions, you can't believe that the whole night has passed when the alarm sounds and you are expected to get up and go to school. It's difficult really to differentiate between the infinite numbers of states of consciousness that we experience. So we tend to divide them into these two broad categories of normal waking consciousness and all the states of consciousness. So just to sum up a little bit, consciousness we can think of as awareness of our own thoughts and our feelings and perceptions, both of the internal events and our surroundings, the external stimuli, at a given moment. Consciousness is a psychological construct because it is believed to exist but cannot be directly observed or measured. So descriptions of consciousness are constructed to explain it. And normal waking consciousness is the state of consciousness we experience when we are awake and aware of our thoughts, feelings, and perceptions. So let's recap and refine what we've been talking about with consciousness. Consciousness can be defined as our subjective awareness of ourselves and our environment. And the experience of consciousness is fundamental to human nature. We all know what it means to be conscious, and we assume, although we can never be sure, that our fellow human beings experience their consciously similarly to how we experience ours. And so the study of consciousness has long been an important subject to psychologists and plays a role in many important psychological theories. For instance, Sigmund Freud's personality theories differentiated between the unconscious and the conscious aspects of behavior. And present-day psychologists distinguish between automatic or unconscious and controlled or conscious behaviors, and between implicit unconscious and explicit conscious memory. And some philosophers and religious practices argue that the mind or soul and the body are separate entities. For instance, the French philosopher René Descartes was a proponent of dualism, the idea that the mind, a non-material entity, is separate from, although connected to, the physical body. In contrast to the dualists, psychologists, for the most part, believe that consciousness, and thus the mind, exists in the brain, not separate from it. In fact, psychologists believe that consciousness is the result of the activity of the many neural connections of the brain, and that we experience different states of consciousness depending upon what our brain is currently doing. The study of consciousness is also important to the fundamental psychological question regarding things like the presence of free will and personal responsibility. Although we may understand and believe that some of our behaviors are caused by forces that are outside our awareness, like our unconscious, we nevertheless believe that we can have control over and are aware that we are engaging in most of our behaviors. To discover that we have, or someone else has, engaged in a complex behavior such as driving in a car and causing severe harm to others without being at all conscious of these actions is so unusual as to be shocking. And yet psychologists are increasingly certain that a great deal of our behavior is caused by processes of which we are unaware and over which we have little or no control. Our experience of consciousness is functional because we use it to guide and control our behavior and to think logically about problems. Consciousness allows us to plan activities and monitor our progress towards the goals we set for ourselves. And consciousness is fundamental to our sense of morality. We believe that we have free will to perform moral actions while avoiding immoral ones and making choices. But in some cases, consciousness may become aversive. For instance, when we become aware that we are not living up to our own goals, our own expectations, or when we believe other people perceive us negatively. In these cases, we may engage in behaviors that help us escape from consciousness, for example, through the use of alcohol or psychoactive drugs. And because the brain varies in its current level and type of activity, consciousness is transitory. If we drink too much coffee or beer, the caffeine or alcohol influences the activity in our brain, and our consciousness may change. When we are anesthetized before an operation or experience a concussion after a knock on the head, we may lose consciousness entirely as a result of changes in brain activity. We also lose consciousness when we sleep, and it is with this altered state that I will leave you for today.